Brett, if you guys will just look at each other lovingly.
I do love him. What does that mean?
I'm saying we're just doing reaction shots.
What's
so
that
we have
middle finger about that?
So we have.
You saw that? Hey, thanks for being with us. I'm here with Pastor Larry today to talk about a big topic, the problem of evil. So let's just start off with this. What do you think evil is?
Evil is when people seek to do harm to others. I think that's where the source of evil is. I think it comes from usually a choice. We see people that do things that are horrific, and we don't understand it. And sometimes the people who are doing the evil may not think they're doing evil. It's perception. For example, 9/11, maybe when they crashed in the towers there, they wouldn't think they were doing evil, but those who were on the ground perceived something very evil was going on. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's perception for whom it's being done. But generally speaking, I think when you seek to do harm to people, I think that's where you've really made a choice that probably is very selfish and very damaged to others, and I think that's probably a simple definition for me.
Is suffering and evil the same thing?
I think that's a good question, and I would not say they're the same. A lot of people suffer for a lot of different reasons, but not necessarily from evil. You could have surgery or have pain and suffer, but not necessarily. It could be from someone repairing your shoulder, or my shoulder, as it did a year and a half ago. That was not necessarily some evil act, but I had definitely had a lot of suffering that went on. What really is sad is when people intentionally, though, choose to do harm, and people suffer because of that. And you can look through history and see instances where millions of people died and genocide, and people suffered. And I think that's probably the epitome of evil. So I think people suffer because of evil, but not all suffering is even equal to evil.
And it seems that a lot of people, where their minds go, is that there's something that they've done that would be thought of as evil in the eyes of God, and so maybe He's punishing them for something that they've done. Maybe they don't even know what it is, you know.
Yeah.
And would you agree with that perspective?
No. I mean, in one of the hurricanes that we had here a few years ago, one of the Christian celebrities came out and said, well, that's what Florida gets because of the evil in Florida. Mm-hmm. This storm is going to come and do this devastation. And I think that just is so inappropriate. I think it's damning to theology. It's damning to God. So, every storm that comes up, someone's being punished. And I'm just not, as you know, the God of the weather is not my favorite analogy for God, because I think it becomes so limiting.
So then the question that a lot of people have, if God is good and the creator of things, then why is there evil?
Yeah, actually, there's three parts to that whole thing in theodicy. If God is good and He's all powerful, mm-hmm. and He's all loving or caring, so if He knows everything, He's all powerful, and He's all caring, then why do bad things happen to me? And that's where the whole concept of theodicy, it comes from two words. Theos means God, and DC is dikaiosune, which is righteousness. So how do you justify the righteousness of God, theodicy, mm-hmm. in the face of evil in the world? And there have been volumes written on this because there's so many different opinions about how this works. And many scholars have spent their lives talking about these very concepts. And it's problematic for us. So today, we'll attempt to answer some of these questions, but this is a big area. Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? And he basically postulated those things. If God's all good and He's all powerful, He's all loving, mm-hmm. then how do bad things happen? And my son, his story is about his son who went through a horrific disease. And he was a Jewish rabbi saying, how do I deal with this? If God's all good and He's all powerful, then and He's all loving. And he was saying, you cannot hold all three of those together. And he was willing to give up on one of those. And the one that he gives up on, well, God is all good and He's all loving, but He's not all powerful. That's the one he gave up. Or at least we need to explain that a little differently. And he spends his whole book in, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People, New York Times bestseller, a very good modern day attempt to deal with theodicy. Now, many people in the area of theodicy disagree with this. with his summation.
Sure.
But he's at least being honest and trying to say, here are the issues. And sometimes life, gives us difficulty and heartache and pain. And we wonder why it happens. If God's all powerful and he's all good, why does this happen? Use another story. I went to do a wedding one time, and it was an outdoor wedding, and the rains were coming, and they prayed, oh, God, keep this from happening. And the next day you could see the weather. You could see the storm parted. And we had this beautiful wedding on a sunny day where it rained to the north and rained to the south. And people were just thanking God for this wonderful thing. Of course, for me, I go, what about the people who had a wedding outside just a little bit south or a little bit north? And that same storm went into Indiana and killed 37 people.
Yeah,
the exact same storm.
There you go.
So you go, how do you justify that kind of concept? Well, we have to back off of it then and say, well, we like to put cosmic things in play when sometimes they're nature. And we try to give the best explanation we can, and sometimes they're inconsistent when you see where the storm ends up. And I like to look down the road. And a lot of the ways that we explain things, we have to look down the road to see, does this explanation ultimately do more damage than good? Mm-hmm. If it does more damage, then maybe we need to rethink it and maybe say it in a more articulate way.
And maybe even admit that we don't know all the answers, which you have said
that's true
over and over again.
We don't know all the answers.
This is a big question that we do our best, like you said. But are some people born evil, do you think? Or do they become evil?
I think people are born with a choice, as most of us are. We make decisions. Some people are damaged by life. I mean, you think about children who grow up in environments where they're abused in a variety of ways, and then later on they develop into what we call evil people. And I think that, I don't know they were born that way, but they had factors that pushed them down that road. And sometimes you look at what someone does ultimately, as horrible as evil is, but you see how this came about.
Yeah.
And you begin to understand how that a personality or a life could have been so damaged that what's being lived out in this horrific thing is not necessarily the best person of who they could be, but a very damaged individual. And that's really sad when I see that. And it happens a lot.
And so maybe a better question to ask is we can't answer completely, why there's evil in the world. We can point out specific evils and say, well, I know that evil occurred because this person decided to do this. But the story or this example that you're giving points out the fact that we just don't know. We're not living the life of this person, and to label them as just inherently evil because he did something wrong that we would call evil negates the truth that there's something going on in that life that you and I haven't experienced. And so isn't this why Jesus says, don't judge?
Yeah,
How could we?
I think so.
Are there places in the Bible that people can go to and see the problem of evil being addressed? Or does it actually even give an answer for that question?
I think so. Some scholars refer to the Deuteronomic view of history. That's the Deuteronomy view of history. The blessings to those who do a good life, who live a good life, and curse to those who do not. So if you obey God and follow his commandments, you'll have a good life. But if you don't, then you have this life of curses. Now that's one of the very ancient thought processes. But as the Bible evolves, the book of Job, which is the most ancient book in the Bible, comes in to refute the Deuteronomic view of history. Well, how so? Well, Job was a man uprighteous. Everything he did was good. And, he loved God. But the story is then all of a sudden, all these terrible things happen to Job. He loses his family. He loses all his wealth. He loses his health. Everything goes bad, yet he does not curse God because he says, I have not done anything inappropriate. His friends come up and say, hey, you must have. So what happens when you look at the circumstances of someone's life and you judge their life based on the circumstances, and this is commonly done, then that's inappropriate. And sometimes in the prosperity gospel movement, you look at someone who's extremely wealthy and you say, oh, they've lived a good life. Yeah. They must really, God loves them. They love God because the outcome is here. Mm-hmm. But you see someone who is very poor or maybe poor health. Well, obviously they didn't live the kind of life they should. But but it doesn't mean that the moral qualities of the person who is poor was less than the person who's wealthy, or vice versa. It's just the outcomes do not determine that whole thing. And the book of Job is written to show that you can be a good person, live upright in everything, and still have terrible things happen to you. And that's the book that's probably the best example of theodicy in the Bible. It's the book of Job.
Would you also say that at the end of Job, that whole story, God gives a really clear answer as to why he allowed all this?
No, he does not. He basically, Job says, just one more time, I won't say anything else. And God basically says, where were you at the foundation of the earth? You weren't here. And sometimes you just have to live your life and trust me regardless of the circumstance. Whether life is good or life is not good, trust me, which takes us to the book of Habakkuk, to where the prophet basically says, why are the bad people going to conquer us? Mm-hmm. And then at the end, he says, even though there are no sheep in the stall, grapes on the vine, I'm still going to trust you, God. And despite the fact that things look terrible right now, I'm going to live my life by faithfulness. I'm going to keep living my life the way I know I should live it. I'm going to aim for the higher good, be the best version of me that I can be. And regardless of the circumstances, I still am going to believe this concept that you're with me, and I'm going to be faithful to your teachings.
So there is no clear answer given in the scriptures about, well, this is why I allow evil.
No.
Fair?
No, agreed.
But what it does do is it says, trust me anyway.
At the end of the day, no matter what happened, life may throw us, 100 years of great health or 20 years of miserable health. But at the end of the day, it's life. And I choose to perceive life as being a gift from God. And even if it contains suffering, I still choose to believe that life is the gift that we have. It's not something that's horrible. I believe in the benevolence, the goodness of God. I believe that the scripture teaches us about the value of humanity, that we're made in God's image and we are valuable. And I think those all go kind of hand in hand. Mm-hmm. So God is
He's in the midst of all of it.
He is
suffering with.
He is the one who suffers with us.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the one who, I put my hand in his in the more difficult times in life. That is where I think it makes a huge difference. Where is he? Oh, he caused all these bad things to happen to me. No, that's the wrong statement. Life sometimes gives us roses, sometimes it gives us thorns, sometimes it gives us people who are evil acting against us, and they work against us, and we suffer. But I choose to believe that faithfulness is realizing that God is with me, and my hand is in his, figuratively, but he's always with me. And his presence is what makes life worthwhile, despite suffering. And if there's any good that comes out of anything evil that happens in the world, is the reality that I don't have to go through this alone.
Good morning. It's a privilege to stand here before you today. It really is. To talk about this very difficult topic in our fourth week of Ask Me Anything. I want you to know that I submitted my own question. It went like this: Dear Larry, how is it that I got stuck with this topic? But in reality, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about because it concerns a faith that is so contrary to intuition, not to reason, but to intuition, that it seems that its origins must be divine. So let me start off by telling you a quick story. When Billy Graham started his ministry back in the 1950s, he had a partner. Most people don't know this. The guy's name was Charles Templeton. And the people that knew them both in those days, many of them would have told you that it's Charles that will ascend to become the world's greatest evangelist. And the reason for that is he was already preaching to tens of thousands of people in stadiums all across North America. Now, we all know that Billy Graham is the one that ascended to be the world's greatest evangelist, but what happened to Charles Templeton? Well, the reason that we don't know about him is because his path took a very different turn than the path that Billy took. His path led him to a lot of plaguing doubts as he became more and more educated and eventually to unbelief. In fact, in 1957, he announced publicly that he was an agnostic. And he ended up writing a book titled Farewell to God, My Reasons for Rejecting the Christian Faith. Lee Strobel interviewed him back when he was writing his book, The Case for Faith. He asked him this question: was there one thing in particular that caused you to abandon your faith in God? And Templeton thought about it for a second, and then he said this: it was a photograph in Life magazine. There was a woman in northern Africa where they were experiencing a devastating drought. She was holding her dead child in her arms and looking up to heaven with the most forlorn expression. I looked at it and I thought, is it possible to believe in a God who is loving or caring when all this woman needed was rain? So Templeton, like many others, lost his faith over this theological conundrum known as the problem of evil. So the question that we got was this: if God is all good, he's all knowing, he's all powerful, then why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? It's a question that's been debated by great thinkers for millennia. It's something that we talk about all the time. There was a debate that, and I think that there are some very good arguments that solve this problem. But when we debated as to whether or not I could lay out those arguments within 15 minutes, the conclusion was no, Brett cannot do that. So, but there are a lot of good resources out there if you need more clarity on the issue and you want to hear some of those arguments. In fact, we recorded a lengthy discussion over this topic last week, and that will be available to watch on our website once we finish editing it. There's also a lot of great books that you can read. The one that I recommend the most is by C.S. Lewis. It's called The Problem of Pain. So the question commonly leads people to disavow their faith. And it's because it's a reasonable question. It's tempting for believers to just kind of write it off like it's a trivial question, but it really isn't. Let me tell you why philosophers debate this so hard and for so long. There is, according to them anyway, a logical contradiction when you say that God is all good. That means that he is nothing but good. Not only that, he's all powerful, so he can do whatever he wants. And yet he decides to create a world where evil and suffering abound. They say that that is a logical contradiction, and there's no way to reconcile these things. If you ask me if they're right, I want you to hear me very clearly. No, they are wrong. There, in fact, are many great thinkers that have concluded that if we believe these things about God, he's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good, there would have to be evil and suffering in the world to achieve the goal of free-willed creatures like you and me. But having said all of that, we need to admit the fact that we cannot prove God's existence, and we cannot prove, if we believe that God exists, that he's good, all-powerful, and all-knowing. God is hidden from us to that degree. There's, in fact, only one thing that we know for sure that belongs to this problem. We know for sure that there is evil and suffering in the world. The other thing that we know for sure is that we have a choice as to how we respond to this reality. As far as I can tell, there's one of three ways. You can respond as a fool, a villain, or a hero. The fool denies the evil and suffering, sticks his head in the sand, and subsequently does nothing. The villain acknowledges the reality of evil and suffering, but then allows things like bitterness or outrage to lead him to thoughts and actions that end up compounding the suffering for himself and for the people around him. The hero also acknowledges reality for what it is, but unlike the villain, determines to do his best to think and to act to bring about good. You see, no matter what you believe or don't believe about God, there's really only one reasonable choice there. So let me tell you a story about a hero I knew that illustrates this truth really well. For our purposes, we'll call him Roger. I met Roger the time when I was involved in ministry downtown with the homeless. He was as crotchety a guy as you would ever meet, and that is no exaggeration. In fact, when he found out that I was a minister, he would seek me out of the crowd just so that he could push my buttons, challenge my beliefs. He was what I call a bitter agnostic. Roger actually believed that there was a God, but he would say that God is something of a giant gastrointestinal exit point. Well, he didn't use those words. So, I was young and naive enough that he could hook me fairly often. And in one heated exchange, I asked him a question. I said, "Why do you bother doing this? I mean, I'm glad you're here. You're serving a good cause. But why are you always so angry and bitter?" He said, "I'm angry because God is a beep hole." I said, "Okay, well, why are you doing it here with a bunch of Christians doing homeless ministry?" He said, "Look, just because God's evil doesn't mean I have to be." Okay, but you don't have to do it with us. You could just do it with organizations that don't have anything to do with God. It's like you want to help the homeless, but at the same time, you want the opportunity to irritate the crap out of us. And with that, he kind of smiled, and he said, "Yeah, that's true in part, but it ain't all that there is to it. Truth is, I think it's better for them if they do believe God is good. I wish I could. At least then I'd have something to look forward to. So, ignorance is bliss." I said, "Then why do you bother pushing my buttons?" He said, "Because you're not as good as you think you are. And you haven't suffered nearly enough to know how bad you can be." Think about that. It's a smart guy. That challenged me more than anything he said to me. He said, then he followed up with, "So I'm doing my part to help you with that by pushing your buttons." I helped out with that ministry pretty regularly over the course of the next 3 years, and that was just long enough to watch Roger change quite a bit. His body changed outwardly as his liver got worse, but you could see inside that Roger was changing in there too. His heart was beginning to soften. Over time, he considered most of us, even the missionaries and pastors, as his friends, and he was less and less cynical about our motives. He died about 1.5 years after I had to stop serving there. I got a call about a memorial service that my friends had planned for him since he didn't have any family. At the service, we got to hear quite a bit about Roger's life that we never knew, and it said an awful lot about his attitude of bitterness toward God. You see, his life was filled with unusual suffering. He lost his mom at age 3 when his little brother was born. He and his little brother, before Roger turned 8, watched their dad die as he was attempting to save a drowning girl. He suffered from an ailment that forced him into retirement early, which he was very bitter about. And his brother apparently couldn't deal with the trauma that he had experienced in his life, and this led to a lot of self-destructive behavior, eventually even second-degree murder. So now his little brother is in prison. So Roger suffered more than the average person, and he suffered in ways that must have seemed like God had cursed him. I got to tell you, I learned afterwards that his wife had attended my buddy's church back when my buddy's dad was the pastor. And she used to complain a lot that Roger hardly ever left the house. He drank himself to sleep almost every night. The only thing he ever did was he'd leave the house to go visit his brother once a week in prison. But this woman was very faithful in that church. She worked diligently every year, all year long, to make crafts. And then she would sell them and give the money to homeless ministry. And that was, of course, very telling. So he suffered more than most, felt that God had cursed him. But I got to tell you that my admiration that day during that service had doubled. I can't speak for everyone else. But as sad a revelation as it was, his choices later in life seemed all the more heroic. The reason that my friend knew so much about Roger's life is because they found a journal that he had used to chronicle his life for the better part of 50 years. A difficult and lowly journey, he chronicled. But he also chronicled, in the end, his determination to honor his wife's legacy. She died just a few years before I met Roger. And the way that he would honor her is he would pretend that God was good, even if he couldn't believe it. So he had more reasons than most people to be a fool or a villain, but Roger chose to be a hero. The author of Hebrews began his teaching on faith saying this: "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen." Let me tell you another way that you could say that. The actions of the faithful build a foundation for the world that we all hope for, and they provide evidence, visible evidence, for the unseen God that they have come to love. I think that that is a worthwhile prayer for all of us to pray, that we, Lord, help us to keep growing to be people like that. So I'm going to have you stand now, and I'm going to tell you the end of Roger's story. My friend finished his eulogizing of Roger by reading the final journal entry that Roger made from his hospice bed just under a week before he died. Here's what he said: "Good morning, Lord. Jamie brought me something from the house yesterday, one of Lizzie's crafts that she made for me when I had to retire. It's a cross-stitch of something from your book. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." James 1:2. I confess I got a little angry with Liz when she gave it to me. It didn't faze her, though. She was already mature enough to see that that's just the rants of a bitter, stony heart, of a man who just felt so cheated by life. "You know, I never noticed," he said, "those little flowers that she stitched on there until now. I never noticed so many good things for so many years. Maybe worst of all, I didn't see your heart. But hindsight really is 20/20. I can see now how it all eventually led to me stepping out of myself and into your shoes. I couldn't see you before that, or at least I didn't recognize you. You were definitely there looking back. You were there in my dad, Liz, even the Yappy twins. Still glad I didn't pay for those dogs. But if I were to leave any good advice for people who are searching, this is what I'd tell them. Don't let anything keep you from getting in the trenches, because God's almost impossible to miss there. Thanks for sticking with me. I'm looking forward to knowing you better real soon. Love and respect, Roger." He learned a valuable lesson, a lesson for all of us, that God and his goodness comes through the courage and faith to go find him in the places where he's so hard to miss, the places where suffering and evil abound. So let's all leave here today with new resolve to know him better and make him better known. Thanks for coming today.